The cemetery keeper's key. I will never forget the sound of the rain on my father's casket. Each drop felt like a final goodbye, hammering into my chest. As the priest's voice droned on, I found my eyes drifting to my father's weathered hands, folded neatly over his silent heart. I felt a sharp pang of regret for all the years we never truly spoke, never discussed the secrets that seemed to linger behind his solemn gaze. After the burial, my uncle approached me with an envelope. A long, waxy seal hung from it, imprinted with an intricate graveyard insignia. Inside, I discovered a single key, blackened with age and carved with symbols I couldn't recognize. "Your father wanted you to have this," my uncle murmured, his breath laced with tension. The next day, I returned to the cemetery to find the caretaker's shack deserted and locked tight. My father had been the keeper before me, and though it was never my path in life, I felt compelled to step into his role. Perhaps because of the key. There was something about it that felt alive. An anxious tremor took hold of my hand whenever I held it, as though the metal bristled at my touch. Despite my doubts, I decided to stay in the small house near the grounds, a ramshackle building covered in peeling paint and ivy. That night, I dreamt of towering headstones dissolving into swirling mist. In the distance, a tall mausoleum cast an elongated shadow across the earth. An indistinct voice whispered, "Heir to the key." I awoke in a cold sweat, heart pounding. The old key lay on my nightstand, still and silent. Yet somehow, I felt like I'd awakened a ghost that had been sleeping far too long. The caretaker's house smelled of dust and candle wax. I spent the morning rummaging through drawers and cabinets, searching for any clue about this mysterious key. My father must have left something behind. He wouldn't burden me with a secret so large without a hint. I discovered a stack of letters addressed to different ancestors, all of whom had apparently been cemetery keepers. Each had mention of the key and a strange, archaic phrase. Ad mortuos custodiendos, Latin perhaps. The more I read, the more I sensed the heavy weight of tradition on my shoulders. We were not mere caretakers, we were gatekeepers. But gatekeepers of what? Determined to find answers, I wandered into the old cemetery. Weeping willow branches swayed in the breeze, and rows of headstones stood like silent watchers. I soon found myself drawn to the crypt at the far edge, a massive stone mausoleum adorned with winged sculptures. Its black iron door bore the same symbols etched into my inherited key. My pulse quickened when I realized the key might fit perfectly into that lock. Yet fear anchored my feet. A numb dread traveled up my spine as I studied the door's engravings. Twisted vines, skulls, and script I couldn't read. That evening, I had another dream. This time, I stood before the mausoleum door, key in hand. An unseen presence hissed in my ear, "Open the way, or they shall find another." I awoke gasping, the echo of that voice ringing in my ears. Although it was just a dream, the weight of the key seemed heavier now, as if it yearned for the stone door. My father had left me a legacy, but I wasn't sure I was ready to face what lay beyond. When I returned to the caretaker's cottage, I found a tattered journal under a loose floorboard. The faded ink spelled out my great-grandfather's name, Eustace Rowan. Most of the entries were near illegible, but one passage haunted me. The key's presence unsettles them. They drift at the edges, shadows in the mist, begging release. I fear they will break free on their own if we fail. I felt a jolt of horror. Break free? Who or what was inside that mausoleum? I decided to read on, flipping through pages that recounted midnight watch duties, the chilling moans echoing from crypts, and fleeting apparitions skulking among tombstones. Eustace wrote, "Our family guards more than bones. We guard their threshold. May it never open unprepared." The more I read, the more I felt I wasn't alone. Shadows in the corners of the cottage seemed to stretch and contract. My own reflection in the window appeared to flicker, like something else was there. Adrenaline surged through my veins as the wind howled outside, carrying faint, mournful cries. That night, I clutched the key, trying to calm my racing mind. My body shuddered with every tiny creak of the floorboards. I couldn't help but remember the words, "May it never open unprepared." Suddenly, The caretaker's old grandfather clock stopped ticking. An unnatural hush spread through the cottage. Then I heard it, a scraping sound at the window. Slowly, I forced myself to look. All I could make out was a shape, tall and gaunt, pressing a skeletal hand against the glass. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the swirl of leaves in the moonlight. Still, I knew something was beckoning, growing stronger the more I learned. I awoke before dawn, compelled to venture into the cemetery. Armed with a lantern and trembling resolve, I navigated rows of leaning tombstones shrouded in mist. The mausoleum stood like a foreboding sentinel. Stone cherubs perched at each corner, their vacant eyes judging me. My heart thundered as I approached the iron door. The key, cold and weighty in my hand, slid into the lock with unsettling ease. For a moment, I hesitated, recalling the phrase from my great-grandfather's journal. May it never open unprepared. Something within me insisted I was far from prepared. I pulled away, carefully removing the key without turning it. Just as I did, I felt a sharp gust of wind slice through the courtyard. The door rattled violently, as though a force inside had felt my near attempt. My lantern flickered, and in that split second of darkness, I heard a multitude of voices sigh, "Open." I almost dropped the key. My spine tingled as if icy fingers danced along my skin. The door's engravings seemed to writhe in the lantern's glow, twisting into ghastly faces. I braced against the urge to scream and slowly backed away. Returning to the cottage, I wondered if I was losing my mind. But the journal had made it clear. The locked mausoleum was the reason our family served as keepers. Our duty was to ensure that whatever lay beyond those doors remained confined. When dawn broke, I made a silent vow. I would find a way to seal that evil forever or risk allowing it to consume us all. Driven by desperation, I searched the cottage for more clues. I found additional letters stuffed into a rusted tin box, hidden behind stacks of rotting books. They were written by different ancestors, each warning of growing restlessness within the mausoleum. Harriet Rowan, 1845. We heard shrieks like dying animals last night. The door shook on its hinges. The key glowed. Jonas Rowan, 1902. Terror grips me. The spirit's hunger for release. Father says the crypt pulses with energy beneath the full moon. What terrified me most was how each letter ended. Guard well the key, for the gate it locks must remain shut. As I read, the house groaned in the wind. I felt a stab of claustrophobia. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. A rancid smell, like decaying leaves and damp earth, wafted through the living room. I followed it to the back door, which I found ajar. Had I left it open? Stepping outside, I saw footprints in the mud leading away from the cottage. They were elongated with deep impressions, as though something exceedingly heavy or unearthly had trod there. I froze, recalling the shape at my window last night. If it wasn't just my imagination, then the cemetery had visitors none of us could see by day. Clutching the key in my pocket, I felt its cold edges digging into my palm. My breath shivered in my chest. I realized then that the boundary between life and death had begun to fray, and it was my responsibility to fix it. Night fell, bringing a pale moonlight that cast dancing shadows over the cemetery grounds. Unable to sleep, I stepped outside with a flashlight, determined to confront my fears. The ancient tombstones glistened under the moon, and a hush settled over the land, broken only by the occasional croak of a raven. I wandered between graves, reading names worn smooth by centuries. A creeping sensation twisted in my gut, as though eyes followed me from every angle. Then I heard them, faint, echoing whispers that rode the night breeze. At first, I couldn't make out any words, just a hushed collective moan. Gradually, one voice rose above the rest, raspy and desperate. "Keeper, return. Fulfill your duty." My flashlight flickered, sending arcs of light skittering across headstone angels. I spun around, convinced I caught a silhouette gliding near the mausoleum. I chased after it, heart hammering. But upon rounding a hedge of overgrown shrubs, I found nothing, only the yawning face of the crypt, its door an unwavering guardian of secrets. My grip tightened around the flashlight, knuckles white. A swirl of leaves danced at my feet, and the temperature dropped noticeably. The door's carvings seemed to shift in the moonlight, forming warped faces sneering in silent torment. Cold terror trickled through me like melting ice. Before I could flee, a sudden gust extinguished my flashlight. Darkness swallowed the cemetery, and the voices returned, hissing in unison. Set us free. Fumbling with the flashlight, I managed to make it flare to life again. But by then, the voices had melted into the night, leaving me trembling before the silent stone gate. Unable to shake the crypt's pull, I decided to re-examine my great-grandfather's journal, hoping there might be a ritual to permanently seal the mausoleum. At first, the words were incomprehensible, but then, hidden between the lines of Latin scrawled across several pages, I noticed a recurring pattern. Eustace wrote of an inscription key, a phrase repeated and underlined. Finally, I found a diagram drawn in the margins, symbols matching those on my key, surrounded by ancient glyphs. Next to it, he had scribbled, "Blood binds. Only Rowan blood can reforge the seal." I felt nausea rolling in my stomach. Blood? Did he mean a literal sacrifice? The idea made me shudder. Yet if this was the only way to keep the restless dead from escaping, I knew I couldn't ignore it. That night, candlelight flickered over the journal's yellowed pages. Outside, wind clattered tree branches against the windows like skeletal fingers. My heart raced as I traced the diagram with a shaky fingertip. The words seemed to jump off the page in a commanding hush. Reforge the seal before the next moon, lest the legion of the dead be unchained. A sudden crash broke my concentration. One of the picture frames on the wall had fallen, glass shattering across the floor. I jumped to my feet, heart pounding. Was it just the wind? Or something else? Fear pressed down on me as I swept the shards away. The sense that I was being watched grew unbearable. If I couldn't decipher this ritual in time, I feared I wouldn't survive the next encounter. As dawn light crept through grimy windows, I searched old trunks in the attic for any family records. My father must have preserved genealogical documents. Indeed, I found a large, leather-bound album with our lineage carefully mapped out. The Rowan family stretched back centuries, each generation listed by name and date of death. Many of them died young, presumably while serving as keepers. In the margins, scribbled notes mentioned causes of death that sounded anything but natural: mysterious disappearance, found lifeless beside the crypt, lost in the catacombs. My gut twisted. Was this the fate that awaited me? Yet I also found references to an old family chapel on the cemetery grounds, long abandoned. According to one note, that chapel housed sacred objects used for sealing rituals. My father must have known. Was this the reason he never wanted me to become the caretaker? I ventured outside, searching behind tall, tangled hedges until I spotted a crumbling structure with stained glass windows. The roof partially collapsed. Inside, pews lay in disarray, splintered with age. A musty, suffocating smell clung to the air. At the far end, beneath a tapestry caked in dust, stood a battered altar. Carved into the stone altar was the same family insignia, the locked gate with swirling lines. A drawer in the altar held a tarnished chalice and a dagger inscribed with cryptic runes. The scene felt surreal, like stepping back in time to witness my ancestors' silent, solemn watch. If the key was the lock, these artifacts had to be the tools to seal it. Steeling my resolve, I carefully packed the chalice and dagger. Part of me already knew, to complete the binding, I would have to offer my blood. As dusk settled, a strange electricity crackled in the air. I sensed movement in the cemetery, fleeting shadows skirting the edges of the chapel windows. The hushed rustle of grass accompanied distant, muted moans. It felt as if the dead had congregated to watch my every step. That evening, I tried to eat, but every bite tasted like ash. My mind churned with images of the mausoleum door bursting open, a tide of shrieking souls flooding the night sky. I paced the cottage, the key jingling in my pocket, a constant reminder of the burden I carried. I drew up a plan. At midnight, I would head to the mausoleum with the chalice, dagger, and key. I'd attempt the ritual from the journal's directions. But as the hour approached, unease took hold, as though my body rebelled against the notion of willingly spilling my blood. 11 o'clock passed. A fierce wind rattled the shutters. At 1:30, I heard heavy footsteps on the porch. I froze chest tight. The doorknob jiggled. My heart climbed into my throat as I raised a trembling lantern. When the door creaked open, only empty air greeted me. Yet footprints on the dusty floorboards led into the living room. My breath shuddered. Something unseen had entered. The clock struck midnight. Thunder boomed outside, though no storm was in the forecast. Panicked, I gathered the ritual items, ignoring the invisible visitor. As I stepped onto the porch, I glimpsed a shifting silhouette in the corner of my eye. Tall, spindly, and vaguely human. A low hiss emanated from where it stood. Then, in a blink, it faded into the gloom. I set off for the crypt, fear spurring me onward. The dead weren't waiting patiently anymore. They were already here. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating headstones like ghastly markers. Rain drummed against my coat as I made my way to the mausoleum. The door loomed in front of me, skeletal engravings seeming to laugh at my trembling form. I clutched the chalice, the dagger, and the key so tightly my knuckles turned white. Reciting the words from the journal, I carefully placed the chalice upon the stone threshold. My voice wavered, forming the ancient syllables that felt forbidden on my tongue. The night's silence enveloped me, broken only by the storm's thunderous roars. Then the wind calmed. An oppressive stillness fell over the graveyard, as if the entire world held its breath. Heart pounding, I pricked my palm with the dagger, wincing as blood pooled. I let a few drops fall into the chalice, mixing with the driving rain. The key began to vibrate, humming with each heartbeat. Suddenly, the door groaned. The iron hinges shrieked, opening an inch. I felt a surge of malevolence wash over me, an invisible tide of anger and longing. My ears rang with inhuman wails echoing from the crypt's depths. Gasping, I pressed the door shut, using the key to twist the lock in reverse. Thunder rattled the skies. I chanted the sealing words, forcing all my energy into them. Each syllable burned in my throat. The door snapped back into place, the key turning fully. An eerie silence followed, tense and suffocating. My chest ached as though I had just run miles. Yet in that calm, I heard a faint pounding from within the crypt. Whatever was inside had not surrendered. This was only the beginning. Moments later, the ground trembled beneath my feet. Cracks snaked across the mausoleum's stone facade, spitting out dust and gravel. I stumbled back, dropping the chalice, which clattered loudly on the steps. The entire cemetery seemed to roar in protest, as tombstones shifted and toppled in the quake. Eyes wide, I could only watch as parts of the mausoleum's decorative arch crumbled, revealing a jagged fissure in the ceiling. A rush of foul-smelling air escaped, swirling into the open night like a swarm of invisible locusts. I sensed movement, a presence unleashed by the partial break. Then, a horrifying sight. An apparition emerged from the crack, pale and contorted. Its face was a shifting mask of anguish. It let out a wail that made my bones vibrate. Instinctively, I raised the key as if it could protect me. The spirit lunged, dissolving into a swirl of mist just before reaching me. My voice caught in my throat. Had I just let something out? In a daze, I retrieved the chalice and dagger, stumbling away from the mausoleum. The quake subsided as quickly as it began, leaving the graveyard in eerie disarray. Back in the cottage, I collapsed to the floor, muscles trembling. The key felt scorching in my pocket, as though alive with dark energy. I knew the crypt's door was locked, but a fresh terror took root. The structure had cracked, giving malevolent souls another way to escape. Sleep eluded me. Instead, I sat in an old armchair, the journal in my lap, stroking the dagger's hilt for reassurance. If the mausoleum had truly been compromised, my family's ancient duty was on the brink of failure. Morning brought no solace. A thick fog clung to the cemetery like a stubborn shroud, muffling all sound. I stepped onto the porch and nearly tripped over muddy footprints, larger and deeper than a human's. They led away from the cottage toward the twisted oak near the crypt, then vanished. Unease gnawed at me. Within the cottage's walls, I heard odd noises. Thumps, whispers, the scrape of furniture shifting on its own. At times, doors slammed without warning. My sense of being watched grew unbearable, as if a legion of invisible guests had moved in overnight. I decided to check the mausoleum's damage in daylight. The crack in the ceiling was wide enough for something non-physical to pass through. Dark scorch marks rimmed the edges, pulsating with faint energy. I pressed a trembling hand against the cold stone. My mind reeled with the knowledge that spirits, once confined, now roamed free. Leaving the mausoleum, I caught a glimpse of movement behind a tombstone. I hurried over only to find nothing. Yet the air hummed with tension, as though these restless souls observed me from just beyond sight. I retreated to the caretaker's cottage, heart hammering. My mind echoed with the question, how could I seal a crack that existed beyond mere physical damage? The pages in the journal offered no direct solution, just ominous warnings. If they breach the walls, the living pay the toll. Bracing myself, I realized the next step had to be a deeper dive into the ritual. There must be a way to contain wandering spirits. But every second I delayed, they spread further into our world. And I was certain they hungered for more than just freedom. With grim determination, I returned to the crumbling chapel. A feeling of dread clutched my insides as I passed through the rotted wooden doors. Dust swirled in the beams of sunlight that snuck through the shattered stained glass. The altar awaited, silent but imposing. This time, I studied the runes carved into the dagger more intently. Patterns of circles and lines pointed to a larger, more complex ritual than the brief chant I had performed. Searching the chapel's corners, I discovered hidden compartments beneath loose floorboards. Inside, I found scrolls detailing a binding circle used to trap restless spirits. My heart thumped with cautious hope. According to the scrolls, the caretaker could draw this intricate circle around areas where souls attempted to breach the veil, sealing them within until they could be exorcised or forced back. The problem? Each circle required fresh blood from the caretaker's line to activate. My legs felt weak at the prospect of giving more of myself. Yet I also knew the alternative was letting these spirits roam free. So, under the chapel's dim light, I committed the runic circle to memory. Suddenly, I felt a sharp chill graze the back of my neck. I spun around. At the far end of the chapel, a translucent figure hovered just above the floor. Its eyes were hollow, face contorted in silent pleading. Before I could react, it vanished in a swirl of cold air. Trembling, I clutched the scrolls and hurried out. The dead no longer waited behind locked doors. They were everywhere, begging, threatening, demanding to cross over. And I alone had to stop them. A scorching afternoon sun provided fleeting courage as I returned to the mausoleum with chalk, salt, and the knowledge I hoped would save us. I scouted the cracked section of stone, tracing the runic symbols in a wide circle around it. My pulse pounded, each line feeling irreversible. Once finished, I spread salt along the lines. The faintest glimmer of light flickered at the circle's edges, hinting the ritual had resonance. Next came the hardest part, an offering of blood. I nicked my arm with the dagger, letting crimson drops fall onto the chalky runes. The circle glowed momentarily, emitting a shrill hum that made my teeth chatter. I waited, heart pounding in my throat. At first, nothing happened, just the oppressive silence of midday heat. Then, a thunderous roar shattered the stillness. A surge of wind erupted from the crack, swirling into a vortex of dust and shrieking echoes. I crouched, shielding my face from flying debris. From the corner of my eye, I saw the glimmer of tortured apparitions, momentarily outlined in the whirlwind. They thrashed and wailed, unable to escape the boundary I had drawn. My soul quivered at the intensity of their anguish, but I kept chanting the incantation. When the wind subsided, the circle remained intact, glowing faintly like embers. The spirits receded, trapped behind the swirl of runes. For the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of triumph. Still, the mausoleum's door loomed ominously behind me, as if warning me that our battle was far from over. Back at the cottage, the evening air was thick and suffocating. Clouds gathered in the distance, rumbling with distant thunder. The wind carried a subtle shriek, as if the spirits still battered at the circle's invisible walls. If the sky unleashed a raging storm, would my fragile chalk lines hold? Lightning forked overhead when the clock struck midnight. Rain poured in sheets, hammering the roof like drumbeats. I pressed my face to the window, peering at the mausoleum's silhouette. A flicker of eerie greenish light pulsed from the spot where I'd drawn the circle. The storm battered it, and each bolt of lightning illuminated ghostly shapes swirling around the crypt. Then came the howling, dozens of agonized voices merging into one clamorous wail. My blood turned to ice. The caretaker's cottage trembled under nature's assault. My candle flickered violently before going out entirely. In the darkness, I heard a series of knocks on the door. Rapid, desperate pounding. I nearly jumped out of my skin. Gathering the last bit of courage, I flung the door open. No one stood there. Instead, a mighty gust rushed in, rattling furniture and slamming the door shut again. In the sudden quiet, I realized the pounding hadn't been from outside. It echoed from somewhere deeper, within the cottage itself. Heart hammering, I grabbed the lantern and made my way through the hallway. Each door I passed slammed behind me without any visible hand. By the time I reached the living room, the knocking ceased. Silence, thick and threatening, swallowed me. Outside, thunder crashed, and I wondered, was the storm a mere coincidence, or had the spirits summoned it to break free of my circle? At the peak of the storm, the windows rattled and shattered inwards, spraying glass across the floor. Rain whipped through the living room, drenching everything. I spun around just in time to see a pale figure drift through the doorway, the same one I'd glimpsed in the chapel. Its eyes, lifeless pits, stared directly at me. I felt a crushing despair, as though the spirit's sorrow bled into my own soul. It opened its mouth in a silent wail, then lunged. My heart seized, but the figure passed right through me, leaving a bone-chilling cold in its wake. Staggering, I clutched at the wall for support. A glance outside revealed more apparitions coalescing on the lawn. They floated aimlessly, occasionally colliding with each other, then scattering. Some pressed their faces against the broken windows, nails raking at the frames as though desperate to enter. Groping for the dagger, I shouted the incantation from the scrolls, praying it would repel them. The spirits recoiled momentarily, letting out banshee-like shrieks. Their forms flickered in protest, but soon they swirled again, drifting in and out of the walls. Fear clawed at my throat as I realized the binding circle around the crack wasn't enough to keep all these ghosts contained. Some must have escaped before I sealed it. Now they roamed the grounds and my home, searching for release or a vessel to possess. I had never felt so alone. Lightning split the sky again, casting nightmarish shadows across the flooded floors. In that flash of white-hot light, I saw multiple spirits converging behind me. With a roar of thunder, they advanced. Panicked, I fled to the attic, hoping the old trunk of family relics might hold another warding object. My footsteps echoed on the wooden stairs, each step a beat of growing terror. Behind me, the door slammed, and I heard scraping sounds on the walls, as if the spirits were crawling after me. Once in the attic, I rifled through trunks and crates by candlelight, tossing aside tattered clothes, broken tools, and yellowed documents. At last, I found a wooden box inscribed with the same cryptic symbol that adorned my key. Inside lay a silver pendant shaped like a half-moon entwined with a serpent. An inscription read, "Prohibere mortuos." It had to be another protective charm. I threw it around my neck, feeling an immediate warmth pulse through my chest. In the corner of the attic, a swarm of swirling shapes formed. The unearthly moans struck a note of raw agony. But as I turned to face them, the pendant glowed softly, pushing the ghosts back. Seizing my chance, I recited the incantation I'd memorized from the scrolls. Ex tenebris, mortuos redire prohibe. The spirits hissed and retreated, their forms dissolving like smoke. My breath came in ragged gasps. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe I was winning. But the house shook again, thunder reverberating through the rafters. A sinking realization took hold. The only way to end this would be to re-enter the mausoleum and secure the final seal from within. Near the stroke of midnight, I returned to the mausoleum, pendant glowing faintly against my chest. The cemetery was in ruins. Countless headstones toppled, uprooted by the quake or battered by the restless dead. Sheets of rain still pelted the earth, forming rivulets of muddy water around my ankles. At the mausoleum door, I gathered every ounce of courage. The key slid into the lock, turning with resistance. Inside was a darkness so absolute, it swallowed my lantern's light. The stale air burned in my lungs, laced with decay and ancient sorrow. Carefully, I descended a short flight of steps leading deeper beneath the mausoleum. Dripping water echoed ominously. With each footfall, I felt eyes in the darkness. My pendant's gentle glow revealed stone corridors lined with tombs. Some coffins lay broken, as though something inside had torn its way out. I navigated labyrinthine passages until I reached a hidden chamber at the heart of the crypt. There, a grand stone altar stood beneath an arch engraved with twisting runes. The air crackled with energy, making my hair stand on end. Grotesque statues loomed in the corners, carved into demonic shapes that seemed to watch me. Setting the chalice and dagger upon the altar, I spoke the words from the scroll, voice echoing in the cavern. Sweat dripped down my forehead. My pulse hammered in my ears. The final step required me to place my blood upon the altar to rebind the spirits to their eternal rest. As I pricked my finger, a roar shattered the silence. From behind the altar, a spectral entity rose, towering and enraged. Its many faces writhed in unholy union, a chorus of anguished screams. This was their true form, an amalgamation of every tortured soul hungry for freedom, and I had nowhere left to run. My legs nearly buckled at the sight of the monstrous apparition. It lunged, skeletal claws swiping the air. Clutching the glowing pendant, I poured my blood into the chalice on the altar, chanting frantically. The crypt shook, dust cascading from the ceiling. Stone statues cracked, and the ground beneath me threatened to give way. The entity let out a thunderous wail, the combined agony of countless spirits. With trembling hands, I lifted the chalice toward the arch. The runes blazed to life, illuminating the chamber in a blinding white light. My voice strained to maintain the incantation, each syllable like shards of glass in my throat. The swirling mass howled, part of it seizing up in the glow. Slowly, the spirits began to coil back inside, as though an invisible force pulled them. I felt my own life force draining, exhaustion hitting me in waves. But I continued, tears running down my face from the sheer force of holding them at bay. Then, in a sudden, ear-splitting crack, the energy surged into the altar. A force erupted from the center, knocking me to the floor. My vision blurred, the monstrous forms shrieking crescendoed, then snapped into silence. Only the echo of my heartbeat remained. Dazed, I looked up. The chamber was dark once more, but the runes on the arch faintly glowed with an ember-like light. The presence of the spirits had receded, drawn back into the crypt's depths. My pendant was cold against my skin, its protective light extinguished. The final binding had taken hold, for now. I emerged from the mausoleum as dawn broke, limbs shaking, face streaked with mud. The storm clouds receded, replaced by a fragile sunrise. Though the graveyard was battered, fallen headstones, uprooted trees, a profound stillness lay over the land. The caretaker's cottage, too, was left in disrepair. Broken windows and scattered belongings bore witness to the chaos of the night. Yet no voices whispered, no shadows moved on their own. The key, now dull and heavy, felt inert in my hand, its purpose fulfilled. Numbly, I collected my few possessions. The duty of my family line weighed heavily on me, but I wondered if any mortal could fully seal such ancient darkness forever. After all I had witnessed, I suspected the restless souls would stir again one day, seeking new cracks, new vulnerabilities. As I locked the caretaker's cottage behind me, I felt torn about leaving. Still, I knew I couldn't stay in this haunted place. The crypt might be sealed, but my mind teemed with nightmares. With the key in my pocket, I walked away, footsteps echoing across the silent tombs, aware that a part of me would remain bound to this soil forever. In the distance, the mausoleum stood as a solemn sentinel. Its door was secure, its secrets slumbering once more. But I knew, in some distant tomorrow, the dead might call again for release. And when that time came, the Rowan bloodline, or what was left of it, would be summoned back to keep the gate locked.